Hi guys, my name is Praveen. That's my partner Santosh there. We are into our 7th year right now. Over the years, we've worked on quite a few of interior architectural projects, but Santosh comes from a landscape background, so we took that decision very early on to collaborate with other architects, and that has worked out really well for us over the years. So it has also exposed us to a lot of interesting projects in various categories. So I'll just run you through some of that. This is probably a challenge that we have faced from the time we started working, in fact, from the time we actually also opened our office. Communicating to a client is probably the biggest challenge, especially when you start off. Nobody really takes you very seriously. So we very consciously tried to put down our process, our thoughts into very detailed diagrams, just to break it down to its core. And then it almost comes down to like stitching this variety of scripts together to form like a story, and then hope that the client finally gets it. And we have been fairly successful in doing that over the years. So what we have done is we just put together a few projects, spread it around the various categories, which kind of will run you through the process that we go through, so it gives you an idea of how we work. So this was a project for Windflower close to the airport. It's a resort just off the airport. The brief was fairly open-ended, but the budget was quite low. What they wanted primarily was to have a visual garden right in the center, so the rooms kind of overlook the central space. The rooms were all designed by Space Matrix, and we were called in to do the landscape. So as you can see, there are quite a lot of existing trees. So the obvious thing to do was to kind of open out the spaces into this central area, and then have these decks which come in interlaced with green. But then the central area, what we did is we kind of channeled it off by providing this water body, and then staggered that water body, and then broke off islands from the main mass to save the trees. So none of the trees that were there were cut, and then actually interconnected the two sides. So it was the feel that we wanted to create was to have this feeling of fields and have these water channels running through. And there was a gradient which worked very well for us from the start at the bottom of the site up to the top, so it was about 1.5 meters. So what we did is actually to break the whole thing into 3 parts, so the plinths kind of match the rooms that adjoin it, and then added the additional green. So as you can see, the site kind of slopes down, and then you have the water channel going through. So that's basically a section, a cross section through the site. So you have the decks, you have a portion of the green, and then you have the water body. So everyone is always connected to the water, and that's finally how it turned out. So because the budgets were low, we kept materials fairly simple. We didn't use any stone at all. It was mostly cement oxide, and then the water kind of runs through the site, but everybody still gets a small bit of an outdoor space with the green and then the water. So this is a project which we did for Punjabi by Nature in Indiranagar 100 feet road just this year actually. That is a site there next to mainland China, the building. So on the second floor they had a fine dining restaurant which was done by their in-house architects. They asked us to do the top floor, which was something new that they were trying. They wanted to make it more youth driven, a lot more open, informal. And that was where also they had the performance stage, the bar, etc. So this was primarily the site. You had the service core on the left, and then there was a cutout at the back which they had already done to connect the two spaces. The 100 feet road is at the bottom. So we very simply just kind of divided the space as we saw fit, depending on the numbers that we had to accommodate. So the bottom space was the open space and the top was the closed. And then we looked at the axis which we wanted to have very strongly. So the stage was placed on one axis, the bar and the screen wall which kind of screened off the staircase at the back was placed at the opposite end. And then you have the seating which happens all around that. So the seating was, outdoor seating was treated more like cabanas, so each space becomes a very intimate kind of space. The services was put, the toilets, the dumbwaiter was all put at the back because the kitchen was right below. And then you have this water body which kind of flows down from this floor down to the top below floor. So as you're climbing up, you see it. And then the whole space kind of, so the whole space kind of opens up. You have these large sliding folding doors which open up into the outdoor space also. And then we also created this mezzanine space on top, which is again connected, works on the same axis. And that was primarily for larger gatherings, community table kind of thing. So that is the site. The mast that you see there is the existing services with the lift and the staircase. So we thought we'll kind of use that height. We took that side of the roof to about 20 feet, span the whole truss across. And we like generally going to site, documenting it at these stages because it always comes into use later. We learn from our mistakes if we have made any. And then the introduction of the mezzanine. The mezzanine was quite a challenge because we had quite a large span. There were no columns in the below floor, so we had to span it from end to end. So we used this girder which kind of spanned across, which also doubled up as a handrail. And then on the other end, we had this truss which kind of holds up the mezzanine. So that here we had a couple of columns so we could rest it on that. And that's a screen wall at the back. The water body. And that's how you actually come up to the space from the below floor. So that's primarily the section through the place. You come up, you don't really see the space, you come past the screen wall, you see the bar, and then it opens out completely. This is a project again in Kanakpura. It was a resort. We were asked to just make an intervention in regards to the entry of the place. So also plan out the parking and everything. So what we did is actually to have a wall, just a blank wall. The black line you see there is just a blank wall, so nobody really knows what's happening behind. A large car park, bus bay kind of thing, and then you walk through the small opening, cross a bridge, and then you just have these two pagodas. So the brief also was to keep this place a little rustic, so the architecture was also kept a little vernacular. So we worked with this concept of these pagodas. The columns, a lot of the materials were already existing, like the columns he already had, so we had to just make use. A lot of the columns are all different heights, so we just had to adjust the plinths. So that is the wall basically that we created. So that becomes the entry, there's no real gate. And then you see those two roof structures at the back. So one of the structures holds a reception, which is like an open reception, and the other is like a small waiting lounge. This was an extension to an office that we did in Koromangala opposite the Koromangala club. So the brief primarily was to create a space where they could have meetings and also entertain clients and also have lunch. So the idea was to create two very light structures. It was primarily a landscape project, but the architecture was almost kept very light. It was almost inconsequential in that sense. So the architecture sits very lightly on the landscape. So it's just about creating this pathway which leads up to the first enclosed space which is air conditioned, and then we created this other pavilion which was semi-open, and then overlaid the green with the water body. So those are the primary the sections through the place. So very low slung kind of structure, completely made out of metal. One with glass and one without. So that is kind of what you see once you get out of the lift, and then it kind of opens out into this large space. I mean, we went for natural lawn. Luckily, we had a depth to play with. And then you just have these two pavilions sitting there. This was quite a difficult project in the sense that it was a housing project where we were given, it was a very narrow site. So the only the scope for us primarily was to kind of do up the driveway right in between the clubhouse landscape, including the pool, and then the entry and the play courts at the back. So there was nothing much we could do with the road because it was narrow. The driveway had to maintain that width. So what we did was to create this visual access. So on one side you have the entry, and the other side you have the play courts, the basketball ring, and then of course the whole of the clubhouse was landscaped, and then there were some of the villaments which had private gardens at the back. So this is basically the section we had. So with whatever little space that we had, we created these small pockets along. So every filament got a small pocket of green, which also became part of the streetscape as you went down. And then we worked with this driveway with a few green inserts, which wouldn't really matter when you drive a car across. And that's after completion. Section to the, so the water body was kind of integrated with the entry. So that's primarily what you see once you enter the property. On one side, you see the basketball court, and then that's the clubhouse with the pool and everything. Views of the clubhouse. This was the mock-up apartment where we also did the terrace. So back in late 2012, we were asked to make a proposal for the duty-free store in the airport in Bangalore. We were quite new to retail at that point. It was one of, I mean, it was a huge ask from us to kind of design this 8,000 square feet store. But the brief was very simple from the airport. They said that they wanted a South Indian theme. So we actually made a proposal, and the client won the tender, and that's how we ended up doing the project. So for those of you who are familiar with the international departure side, you have the security gates happening there, and then you kind of get out, and then that's where the duty-free store is. So most duty-free stores around the world are quite generic. In that sense, there's no real sense of place, so they can be placed just about anywhere. So we were very particular that we create a space which is very Indian, more South Indian in that sense. But any duty-free store, for that matter, is quite chaotic. So we took care of the basics in retail, in airport retail first. So we took care of the circulation bit, the visual access, the circulation of how customers will move through. So this invisible kind of pathway was created just by placing the fixtures. And then we landed up with this layout. So how do we kind of unify this whole space into one kind of space? So duty free, as you know, has tobacco, liquor, confectionery. All the fixtures can be generic, branded. So there is a lot of chaos on the floor. So we needed an element which kind of will bind all that together in the ceiling. So after doing some research, we kind of zeroed in onto the concept of the rangoli, or the kolam as they call it here. So based out of a very simple grid, there are these very intricate patterns that are formed. So we looked at breaking that down, cleaning it up, and then kind of more or less finalized upon this one unit. And the reason also why we chose this unit is had this opportunity to extrude it into a ceiling element. And then we made mock-ups. We tried various materials. FRP was something that we chose. The client had luckily a good budget, so we could push for it. And then we kind of started placing that on a grid and seeing how it's going to look, and then skewed the grid. So as you move through the store, the ceiling kind of moves with you. And then the only colored elements are these acrylic panels that are in between. All the lighting sits very nicely inside. So that's what you finally see. So the ceiling kind of unifies the space because fixtures on the ground keep changing. Brand's not doing well, it goes out, something else comes into place. And this is how it looks today. This is a project we also did for Windflower recently. They had a badminton court, quite an uninspiring building in that sense. They wanted to convert it into this convention hall which they can rent out for functions and things like that. So basically it's this one mass with this pitched roof which is like completely out of proportion in that sense. So what we had was this block with this very disproportionate roof. So what we did first was to clean it up, kind of pronounce the entry. The budgets were also, they asked us to keep it quite minimal, so our interventions were also quite restrained in that sense. So what we had to do was to kind of create a mass on top to make it look, kind of balance out this huge mass at the bottom. So we created the structure, we redid the gutters on top, so all the rainwater is taken care of. The roofing also is completely changed because it was asbestos. And then we added the whole landscape. Luckily there was a lot of trees around, so there's nothing much we had to do in terms of landscape because there's a lot of borrowed green in that sense. This is after completion. So also there was this large area in the front which had to be converted into like a pre-function area, so we cleaned it up, changed the material, created this wall so that it's not seen from the car park. The inside was used as a badminton court. It had this very nice natural wood flooring which we decided to retain. We got rid of the false ceiling, had to introduce the air conditioning system. So we did this whole metal framework which spanned between the trusses and then wrapped it with rope, and all the lighting was kind of taken care of within those panels. Punjabi Miniature again in Whitefield. This was quite some time back. The site was primarily like a commercial building. The restaurant was on the ground floor, which was done by the in-house architects. We were just asked to kind of do the outside area with the entry and everything. This was actually a car park which was then converted into this entry space. So again, we looked at the entry because the restaurant by itself didn't really have a facade. So we created this whole pavilion kind of feel where you kind of enter through the pavilion, also doubles up as a waiting lounge, and then you walk across to the restaurant. And also the water bodies act as visual gains as you from the restaurant. So the water bodies are spanned right across the length of the compound wall, and it's a double-sided water body so that you have the tray on top and the water flows on both sides. So that is primarily the elevations, and that is the restaurant, the back. So this is what you actually see from the road or from the inside. And that is what we finally did. So recently we have started to interest ourselves in the whole idea of pattern making. So for especially our landscape projects, we work with a lot of paving. So we've been looking at this idea of creating a unit, rotating it, repeating it, and then working on some kind of a gradation. So it creates a very interesting pattern where the hardscape actually kind of disintegrates into the landscape. So this is for a courtyard space we did for a house which was the architects were PR design. This is after completion. So same, we started to explore that on vertical surfaces using metal as an element, and this creating these screens which work very well as privacy screens, cabanas. This was a project that we did with Cadence, the terrace. So the cabana sits right up front facing the road, so it's just a nice glass railing, and then the space kind of opens up at the back. And this facade that you see there on top was we had these pivotable screens which can be opened up if they want, otherwise it's kept closed. So that's what you see there. The lower court. And with this project especially, the architecture itself was quite fluid in that sense. So we had to kind of match our interventions to go with the architecture, which is something that's very important when we work with other architects. It's to try to understand also, their style stamp, which is critical. The detail of the planter. And that's the planting, same courtyard from the road. This is another project we did with Cadence. Here we worked with the courtyard which was inside, and then we looked at these patterns which can be rotated, repeated, worked on the same principle, and then the whole idea of the gradation. Thank you.